Okay, friends, thank you so much for joining me today. This is Kristen Carey hosting the Living Truth podcast, and I am very excited for my conversation with Dr. Natalie Atwell. Natalie, thank you for joining me today as a guest on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to tell you guys about Natalie. Dr. Natalie Atwell has 20 years of experience in mental health. She leads a private counseling practice in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, along with serving as an adjunct faculty member at Liberty University in the clinical mental health and school counseling programs. She also serves in her local county human trafficking task force. Natalie brings so much experience, and I'm very eager to discuss spiritual warfare, deliverance, and mental health with you, Natalie, today. Just to kind of summarize, what is it about this topic that you are so passionate about?
Well, I'm passionate about it because I don't feel like enough people are talking about how the spiritual forces of darkness are really going after people, and then it manifests as mental health. So often, even within the church, honestly, we talk about human sin, and that's important. That's an element of it. But we don't talk about the influence from spiritual forces of darkness. But that's biblical too. And I think we need to talk about that. And especially with, the podcast emphasis that you have of unwanted sexual behaviors, a lot of times people are really suffering within their own self. They don't understand where it's coming from. And I would say it's not always coming from your own human sinfulness.
Yeah. And most of our audience, especially the people with the unwanted sexual behavior, have pretty moderate to severe trauma from childhood. And the enemy does not have to work nearly as hard in your adult life when like lies and vows are planted in our hearts from very young. I mean, we kind of go on autopilot, don't we? But it's not without hope. It's not without hope. So tell me some of what you've seen in your own practice. I know you mentioned an uptick in seeing evidence of spiritual warfare in your clients' lives. Tell me more about that. What kinds of things are you seeing?
Yeah, well, we're seeing a lot of use of darkness. So people using things that are blatantly affiliated with the forces of darkness, such as divination or new age practices. And some of it's touted as wellness. So they're trying to deal with trauma, or they're trying to deal with certain addictions or behaviors. And then they use things that actually open them up to more darkness or push them further into the darkness. So that's one thing we noticed. But we also just noticed more darkness in the sexual behaviors. Like, we've dealt with sexual sin for a long time, but there's been an increase in how, like, it's just gotten even darker. And to be honest, the amount of more Christians being tempted and people falling in the church, like, it's kind of hard to like get away from all of the sad stories that you're hearing. And not that it at some level hasn't always been there, but there's been a huge uptick. Gender confusion's a big one that we've seen that was never like, before 5 years ago. It was definitely not at the rate that it is now. And again, that's also within the context of the Christian families a lot of times. But we're seeing people that are just addicted to other things like social media, the comparison, all those things. But really, where we noticed it is just there were so many different dark things that we saw coming, or people were just stuck in these maladaptive patterns and could not get out of that. And I really felt led of the Lord after, to be honest, experiencing my own warfare, to start digging deeper and asking more questions about where some of this is coming from. So we started assessing it.
I'd really like to hear your own experience if you're willing to share it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll be honest, it came when I was at a time when I felt like God was calling me to really combat a lot of darkness, and that was in the area of human trafficking, to be honest. I had been asked to be on the board for a local nonprofit, faith-based agency. And so that combined with really in my work, focusing even more on making sure people knew who we were as counselors, being a faith-based practice. Although we see people who are not Christian,
Sure.
I was not hiding from it anymore. I was like, I'm going to put a statement of faith on my website. So it's really, to me, the warfare really increased in my life when I felt like I was trying to walk closer with the Lord and combat the darkness. And it's like, wow, the enemy just really did not like that. And I've had those times in my life before, but 3, 4 years ago, I was like, wow, I am being battled on every front. So
Yeah.
I felt it from my kids, my marriage, my work, things that I had never had issues before. And even in the ways that I started studying how the enemy attacks you, because I think you should know your enemy and know what you're up against.
Yeah.
The temptations that I had never had before that were coming into my life, just different things like that. I was so glad that the Lord was finally showing me this is warfare and
Mm.
praying for me and praying over me. And so my strategy is to go after what that thing is and figure it out, learn it.
Yeah.
Sort of like, let's go in the war room, let's figure out who the enemy is, what their strategies are. And that led me into really seeing things on different levels. And it helped me. It also helped, I'm hoping it helps my clients. And they have said that it has. In our
Yeah.
whole practice, we talk about these things all the time. And we say the veil is getting thinner because it's almost as if the enemy is not hiding anymore in the ways that they are really going after people. And they do, to your point, go after the ones who are vulnerable. And what's beautiful about vulnerability though is that they also have this potential for this sweet holiness with the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean, the weak and the vulnerable are like very near and dear to God's heart.
yeah, they are.
Yeah. And we all ultimately are that. We are, and we are ultimately vulnerable as human beings, but especially when we are our children. So heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I have so many questions I want to ask you, Natalie, but okay, tell me more about what you do. And I know it's custom based on what your clients are coming to you
Sure.
with, but can
Yeah.
you give us some examples of how you would A, identify, oh, this is a warfare element here, and B, what do you do to help that person? Because they have to take authority over it in their own life. It can't just be like you pray for them as a therapist, right? Like we open doors or make agreements with the enemy. We're giving him permission, right? And authority, and we have to take our authority back. So I'm sure one of your big roles is just helping them become aware that's what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a big call here for us to expose darkness. And we
Yeah.
really are doing that initially through assessment. So we, someone comes in for counseling and we ask the normal assessment questions, why are you here? Tell us about your background. What do you want to work on? All the different things that you would normally assess within
Mhm.
the context of a mental health setting. And we go at it from that angle. Now, if they say, hey, my spirituality includes new age or something like that, then we kind of know there's some darkness there to a degree.
Yeah.
But or if they've had certain types of sexual behaviors and things like that, we know that there's something surrounding that. But we usually go the normal mental health routes, treat it the way we normally would. And then if we get stuck or we feel like there's really something else going on here, then we will do the assessment that I created called the Other Influences Assessment. And we ask some really deep questions about themselves, about their family. They're open-ended questions, so there leaves room for them to really share what they want to share. And then, depending on what they've answered, then we slowly go through all of those issues, how it is impacting them today. A huge part of it is what are the lies that you're believing about yourself or about God or others as a result of this thing that you engaged in or someone else, opened you up to.
Mhm.
And we kind of go at it from that way. But we follow a biblical model of casting out, renouncing, confession, repentance. And it's a beautiful thing. And that sounds simple sometimes, but it can be a lengthy process because people didn't get here overnight. And it takes time for them to build trust with a therapist. And it takes time for them to really be able to share some of the deep, dark things that they've been through or that they've engaged in. And then we have to slowly, like, okay, let's start looking at the things that you've believed about yourself. and let's identify what the lies are, because that's really what the enemy does. He lies often. And, how can we combat that with biblical truth? And
Mm,
it's been really powerful. It's been as simple as someone who is dealing with marriage problems and started using crystals to try to overcome. And we're like, that's not going to work. You're opening yourself up there. It's been as simple as getting rid of that and let's work on
yeah.
some other deeper marriage issues. Two, as, deep as there's been people who have been heavily involved in traumatic things like maybe trafficking or deep, dark sexual things that are related to the darkness. And maybe their
Yeah.
family did that to them or whatever. And, how do we get rid of that and deal with that? So it's been pretty vast, to be honest.
Yeah. I would love to hear when you do work with victims of trafficking, because I know you do see trafficked individuals at your practice.
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, my first go to is the level of compassion and care to be extended. But then how do you address this particular issue? Because clearly they've been victims of
Mhm.
the enemy.
Oh yeah, it's such a dark thing, and it is. It's so hard. But even to be honest, even some of the perpetrators, like you can see, like their humanity has been attacked by the enemy for them to even do what they're doing. I mean, so many victims end up becoming traffickers at some point. And that's one, to be honest, it's real easy to see the darkness in that because it's just dark when someone perverts someone who's innocent and
Yeah.
uses them for that type of purpose, something that was intended to be beautiful and designed by God for a beautiful purpose, the way the enemy perverts that. And that's really a lot of sexual behaviors. And I think that's what God has really shown me through the warfare piece, is that that is one way that it's a lot of sexual temptation, or really arguably all of it is rooted in forces of darkness trying to ruin humanity.
Yeah.
And they're not always the easiest people to work with, to be honest. Sometimes they're hard. Sometimes they get into those patterns and they don't know what else to do. So there's been times where we've dealt with victims and, we're going through a really good process of counseling with them. They're getting healing. They're, starting new behaviors and thinking patterns, and then they go right back into these bad patterns because it's what they know. It's what was easy for them. And or
It's
they
not
run
the
away,
only
they
way
run
they
away.
deserve.
Yeah, or that part. Lots of different
Yeah.
things. And so those are the heartbreaking times, to be honest. But then there's also the victims who, won't know part of it and they're struggling socially. I know I'm thinking of one right now who was trafficked by her father.
Oh,
And like she struggles socially now because she just doesn't trust people.
of course she doesn't.
Yeah, but the beauty of being able to say to someone, um, there was a dark force behind your dad doing this to you, also brings a level of humanity back into that person that can bring healing to someone. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah. Yeah. That is so powerful. Okay, so for especially for any of my betrayed partners here, I'm going to give a little trigger warning because I'm going to ask Natalie more about her work in this area of human trafficking. And before we hit record, you were mentioning how many people still believe that it's not really a thing, it's not really a problem because it's not in our faces. And I was saying, well, with the population we work with, especially the people dealing with unwanted sexual behavior, primarily men in our ministry that are dealing with unwanted sexual behavior, many of them have gone to prostitutes, and maybe they don't realize, but many of those prostitutes are actually trafficked individuals. So this is a very real problem.
Yeah, it is a very real problem. And, I also have met with people who have been trafficked and then they've trafficked themselves, which is prostitution, like you're saying. But
Yeah.
I've met with people who were trafficked by their partners. And
Yeah.
a lot of times it's through websites where you have, it could be a man thinking, I want to go on some website and meet up with a girl for dinner and escort service or whatever. And there's sexual sin related to it. And they have no idea that there's someone else behind, even an online type relationship like that, that is being trafficked. So yeah, it's so multifaceted. There's a lot of adults who are, there's a lot of younger people. I think a lot of times people think about it as minors primarily and girls, but it also can be boys.
Yeah.
And I think it's increased, obviously, just like a lot of sexual perversion and sin with the internet and just
Oh
the
yeah, the pornography industry has like been
absolutely.
gasoline on this fire.
Yeah, it's so true. And I will say that there's just so much darkness behind it.
Yeah.
And this might be a little weird for you or your audience, but I believe it's rooted in Genesis 6 to a degree in Genesis 3, the fall of man, but then in Genesis 6 when there was so much perversion before the time of the flood. And if you go back to ancient text, it talks about the fallen sons of God, which were divine beings who mated with humans on earth,
Yeah.
and they created a race. There was an interaction, there was a sexual interaction that was prohibited by God.
Yeah.
And that sexual perversion, I think that was just one of many.
Yeah.
Some theologians even believe that's where trafficking started,
Mm.
was then. Like, was it the daughters of Cain who, they were trafficked to these divine beings and there was this giant race created? And I tend to believe that's where all sexual sin really was formed. And it was because there were divine beings who rejected God, who rebelled against the Most High God, and they hated that humans had dominion over earth. They hated humans. And so, any way that they can attack humanity, and think about it, sexual perversion, sexual sin is such an attack on your humanity, which means you're an imager of the Most High God.
Yeah.
And so, for people who are being even are tempted out there, I want people to know that it's not all you and your sinfulness. Yes, that's a part of it, but a lot of that attack from sexual sin is coming from dark forces.
Yeah.
And I say that because there's freedom in that, knowing that, oh, if it's not all me, I'm going to combat this evil force then. And you need to know where those influences are. And a lot of times it is in very, very dark places and it's all around you. And so I hope that answered your question.
It does. It does. And so for our listeners who say are the person that struggles with unwanted sexual behavior, do you have any words of wisdom for areas they need to look at where perhaps they have been unwittingly, unknowingly allowing the enemy to control them and they need to do some house cleaning, some warfare?
Absolutely. And that looks different. It can look like, because temptations are different for everybody. It could look like you may have some beliefs about the past. You could have watched your father be someone who sexually abused your mother, or you could have watched your mother be someone who was, committed adultery over and over again. And so, because of the people who you loved,
Hmm.
you saw those things happen, then there's just this natural thing in the way our brains function that we are shaped by who we love. And so we repeat things that we see, for good or
Absolutely.
bad. Now, you don't have to because you can take control of that. So sometimes it could have been opened up by things that happened in the generations before you,
Hmm.
or it could be you opening it up. And a lot of times that does happen through pornography or from choices that you're making. Um, it can start with a simple conversation, but I think the biggest thing is to know that the enemy is trying to destroy you. He's trying to destroy your humanity. He's trying to destroy your marriage, your children, and your children's children, because our
Yeah.
choices influence them as well. And it could be as simple as they went and were opened up to it from a wellness perspective. And here's another one. I mean, it's so convoluted. There's so many different ways it could be opened up, the darkness, as when it relates to sexuality for sure, because it's so prevalent in our society these days. But um, I would say even when you're seeking help, like through a counselor, make sure it's a godly Christian person, because a lot of times you may be going to seek help and they may introduce you to darkness. They may suggest things that are not going to help your marriage.
Okay, can you give us some examples where people might think, oh, this is benign, but it's actually a doorway to warfare?
So a counselor who's not a believer and says, hey, you should look at pornography as a way to help your marriage, or there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or,
I feel like that's an obvious one because it's especially for our audience,
yeah.
it's like, no, that's like what has destroyed our marriage, actually. And
Mhm.
you mentioned crystals, which I think some people might think, oh, what's the big deal? It's just a rock.
Yeah.
What are some others that maybe are tricky that sound like a wellness thing, but it's actually opening a door?
It's really opening a door. Yeah. It related to sexual sin or
I
anything.
mean, yeah, yeah, anything.
I think again, social media being addicted to technology, social media is
Mhm.
a part of our world. It can be leveraged for good.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence can be leveraged for good, but also the enemy can get into those avenues, and it's so hard to get out of those patterns. So I do think that those can be a doorway at times. So you have to really set good boundaries around that.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes here's a one that people talk about often within marriage circles is the Enneagram. And now I know people are probably going to be mad about that I said that, but this is just an example. So that
I've
actually,
heard that it's controversial. I mean,
yeah,
I know some Christians, solid Christians who love it, right? And I know some who say that there's demonic roots, and I'm still not sure what I believe about that.
yeah. And so, and I get what you're saying, and I was there too, and I had to do a lot of research. But here's where I'll show you a lot of these things kind of have a slippery slope. And so that is a pagan, it's not a psychological assessment. It wasn't researched, it wasn't designed that way. It's rooted very much in pagan influences and all those types of things. Well, here is how a lot of people say, oh, it's good. It helps me understand myself. It helps me to understand others, our marriage, all that stuff. Well, what I've seen in marriage counseling is somebody comes in and says, I'm an Enneagram 1 or I'm an Enneagram 9, wing, whatever. And then they make excuses for their behaviors
Mm,
because they say, I'm this person. This is just who I am. And that's how the enemy can get in through a tool like that.
hmm. I think that one of the most common human conditions that the enemy loves when we do this is when we make excuses and rationalize our unhealthy behaviors rather than seek to continue to grow and heal and become all that God has created us to be. And
Yeah.
yet it's
Deception.
so easy to do it. And we all do it to some degree, don't we? Until we become more aware over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one is like psychedelics, and that's very controversial as well. But I really believe that's huge in opening people up to darkness. And if someone who's struggling with unwanted, sexual, behaviors or things in their marriage and it's
Yeah.
rooted in trauma and they're so desperate to deal with that trauma because they see how it's manifesting in their life and their marriage, like I understand that need to want to do anything to get rid of that.
Hmm.
But psychedelics is not the answer. There's
Yeah.
that is so rooted in darkness, and you're opening yourself up to another realm that you don't know what you're getting into there.
I feel like there's a similarity here with the spiritual warfare element and the trafficking element in that most people don't see evidence in their face of
Oh,
either.
so true.
So it's easy to ignore and deny that these are real issues and problems, um, if you don't see it. And on the flip side, I'm going to tell you, like, in some ways for me, I've been in ministry my entire life, and so I mean on the mission field and stuff, I've had phases throughout my life where like warfare heat is turned up so high it's like it's like insanely obvious, right?
Yeah.
And then there's other times where I think I've been more dealing with like childhood trauma and like childhood
Sure.
PTSD type stuff. And because warfare is something I know, I will pull out some of my books with prayers, right, for warfare and like try to, like, what is the lie and what is the, like, try to deal with it or seek deliverance, right? And
Yeah.
so and one thing that has unfolded over time is, yes, there was a lie that the enemy planted from
Right.
from very young of these abuse patterns or traumatic patterns. Um, but the way to get free and healed isn't just to break the lie because
Right.
there's
Yeah.
so much more to healing trauma. So I do want our listeners to know, like,
Absolutely.
Natalie and I, neither of us are saying this is a formulaic three-step
No.
process to get free, right? It's complex. Trauma and warfare go hand in hand. But if you're somebody who's like, I don't know if this is real, I don't know if this is really true, the whole warfare thing. If somebody is kind of a doubter, what would you suggest that they do with that doubt?
Well, if they're a believer, I would say pray about it and seek the Lord, seek his word. And I would show them biblical passages where I could show that it could be rooted in that. I also do caution people against spiritual bypass, which is blaming everything on spiritual issues. You don't want to do that as well, because that's
Right.
real. And then I'll show them things like, to be honest, everything at some level is related to spiritual darkness and fall, but that doesn't mean the answer is always the same for how it's dealt with. Jesus didn't always heal in the exact same ways. So we don't always do that either. I'm also not against medication. I'm not against, obviously, counseling and other types of things. I think the important thing to note that we've gotten away from is that there is a force of darkness trying to steal, kill, and destroy. And a lot of times it does look like, sexual darkness, or it looks like things that you don't want to acknowledge that are there. It can look like trauma.
Yeah. I think of all of my listeners who have gone through betrayal, and I think that so many of them are at a point in their life where it's never been clearer how intensively the enemy has been working to steal, kill, and destroy, because it feels like their whole marriage, their whole life, the foundation of what they thought their relationship was, and everything they've built their life upon has been destroyed. So specifically with that audience in mind, Natalie, what would you say to a person who's reeling from having experienced that steal, kill, and destroy, and they're the one that's laying in the rubble? When it comes to addressing this from a spiritual warfare and deliverance standpoint, what are your thoughts? What would you say?
Well, I would say number one, the people that I have dealt with who are experiencing that are some of the most precious people you would ever meet.
Yeah.
And it almost makes me, I'm like, every single time, because it's the most precious person. Lots of time it's people, it could be people in ministry, it could be people who have the biggest hearts. And you're like, how could that person betray this person?
Yeah.
And it's because the enemy goes hard after those who are seeking after him, who are trying, and maybe there was so much potential for goodness within that marriage, and or it was really good at a certain time. And I think those people often struggle to believe the lie of the enemy that they should have done something differently, or it was their fault, or all those things. Like, what did I do? And I've heard that in some of the strongest believers, and I'm like, whoa, you were never perfect. You were not supposed to be a perfect spouse, but this is not on you.
Nope.
Just like
I
it's not your job to save their soul either. So that's
yeah.
one of the biggest lies. And that's one that a lot of people have to overcome when they come into counseling after that. There's a lot of self-hatred in that too. Like, they almost always, what could I have done differently?
I know. It's so sad. And of course, we know that Satan is an accuser, right? So
Exactly.
when we're at our lowest, when we're at our weakest and our most vulnerable, for him to come after us with a huge accusation like that is not surprising.
Mhm.
Um,
When in
it's,
reality, a lot of times they've done everything they possibly could do.
yep.
They've prayed every prayer. They
Hmm.
have been faithful. They have done all the things that God would honor and say, well done. And it's just simply on that other person who's being attacked and who's giving into their own selfish, sinful natures.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. It is extremely traumatic.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think knowing that, like for believers, the enemy really does, there's specific ways he attacks you. It's through temptations, it's through the accusations, like you're saying, infirmity, a lot of times, and
Yeah.
oppression. And if you know those things, like praying against that, and then
Mm.
trusting that God's sovereign, that even if this has been allowed in your life, like he's not done with you, that there's beautiful things that can come from ashes. And I do talk about spiritual darkness and the forces out there, and they're very powerful, but we serve a God who's more powerful. He can help you overcome that. He can help you find healing and restoration. And
That is so hopeful. Well, just to sum up this topic of spiritual warfare and deliverance, is there anything else that you want to give our audience in your words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would just say know that there are forces out there trying to still kill and destroy you that are not of God, but to be faithful, to stay faithful in following the one true God. It's worth it. It's not easy. And know that He will help you and to ask for His help and armor up daily and to
Mm,
know, what those strategies are and question everything. If somebody introduces a new practice to you or a new idea, or and there's some discernment in your spirit, like really lean into that and question it. And, don't just believe everything that you hear that might be helpful and end up not being helpful in the end.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your heart to our listeners.
Thank
Natalie, it's a joy to talk to you. And friends, if you're listening and you have not yet rated or reviewed the Living Truth podcast, would you take a moment to do that? When you rate or review our podcast, it helps other people find us. It does something to the algorithm so that more people can get the hope and the healing after unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal. And until next time, I am holding out hope for you.